Hello, beautiful community. Let's do a quick Vlad Reacts episode by reacting to thoughts on a post-Putin Russia from the Russian oppositional figure Vladimir Kara-Murza. So let's listen to Vladimir. I'm going to do it from bed. You're going to do it from wherever you are, but we're going to try to get some value out of this. So let's go.
It's very important for the free world, for the leaders of Western democracies, to prepare on their side as well. Because once things really do change in Russia, and once, we do start this work on transitional justice, on this transition from dictatorship to democracy inside of Russia, it is very important that the free world stands ready to help reintegrate that new democratic post-Putin Russia back into the civilized world, back into the rule-based international order, back into the big Europe that we all want to see. If we still believe in that goal of a Europe whole, free, and at peace, a goal was expressed, famously 35 years ago by an American president speaking in West Germany, as you remember. If we still believe in the goal of a Europe whole, free, and at peace, that goal will only be possible when Russia, which is the largest country in Europe, also becomes peaceful and democratic. A Europe whole, free, and in peace will only be possible with a peaceful and democratic Russia as a part of it. And this is a roadmap that we need to start preparing today.
Okay, beautiful community. Let us try to analyze this, and I apologize because of physical symptoms. I may have some slips. Now, the first thing to say about Vladimir Kara-Murza is that in many ways he is as much a moral as he's a political agent. So when he went to prison in Russia, he didn't go to prison as part of a political project he was elaborating. He went to prison largely because he got picked up and he took a stance against an abhorrent regime. Whereas Mr. Navalny's tragic imprisonment was much more a part of Mr. Navalny's political project. Mr. Navalny's imprisonment for Navalny was meant to get him from A to B politically. It was a deeply political process for him. For Mr. Kara-Murza, it was more of a moral stance that got him there. The imprisonment itself wasn't for him a political project. That's one thing to say. The second thing to say is that when you're talking about Russian opposition figures, it's important to understand which ones are speaking to a Russian audience and which ones don't, or which ones no longer do, and not get confused about that. So a very classic example of somebody who speaks to a Western audience without much of his audience understanding that that's what he does is Garry Kasparov. Gary is a pro-democracy and anti-Putin activist in the West. He's speaking to you. Don't make the mistake that he's speaking to Russians. He is to some extent, but you're his main audience. And within the Russian opposition, you've got to keep making that distinction. And so on the basis of it, we would say that while Vladimir Kara-Murza has been enormously politically influential and engaged, he has more of a Western than a Russian audience in my judgment. And if you took him, plonked him on the street in Russia, his name recognition may not even be greater than his father's, about whom none of you would have heard about. His late father died a few years ago, and in recent years was facilitating democratic, in a journalistic capacity, democratic and anti-regime conversations. So that's Vladimir Kara-Murza. That's the context. If you swap over to somebody like Ilya Yashin, then you're going to be dealing with somebody who is very directly speaking to a limited but a Russian audience. That's less obvious with Vladimir. So that's the second thing to say. Let me then say a third thing. Never be gleeful and jump up and down in an infantilized way, scoring points of somebody who's just been in jail on matters of principle, who's just been in jail because he's opposed to the war and opposed to the Putin regime, right? So just because you think some things he says are silly, there's no reason to jump up and down, because that's a good way to embarrass yourself, not him. So with this context, let's jump into a little bit of analysis. And because I'm speaking to you from bed, I'm just going to be completely personal. There is such a term as moral charisma. And I think it's a wonderful term. It captures people whose distinctive loveliness is part of their moral, is deeply tied to their moral sensibility. And that's true of Vladimir Kara-Murza Jr. At the same time, because I'm going to be just personal and direct with you, oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God. Are we in 1989? Or are we just a brilliant individual, but we are speaking about politics apolitically? There is a kind of almost seraphic moral purity in what Kara-Murza is saying that is detached from politics. And oh my God. So it's really the impression of listening to something childlike. Let's break this down. Number one, what Western order is Russia going to be joining? A future Russia, a democratic and non-democratic Russia, together and untogether Russia. What Western order is it going to be joining? The post-1989 order has broken down. It's not there. Putin didn't break it with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. He did the full-scale invasion of Ukraine because that order was broken. And here it's very important that if we are critical of these remarks by Vladimir, we've got to be critical of ourselves too, because we swim in the same bubble. There is no post-1989 global order. It has broken down. We live in a complex world of frenemies. Friends and enemies in certain respects. All you have to do is just reflect on how far Russia is not isolated politically and economically across the globe, and how much we ourselves in the West are refusing to isolate Russia. It's a complex world of enemies that aren't enemies all the way down. They're enemies that are still able to cooperate in various respects. They're sort of a world of enemies in certain respects, without a prospect of a new stable global order emerging. We have democratic decline across the West. We have US retreat, right? What's so weird about all of the upset about the United States not supporting Ukraine enough, these are legitimate claims, of course, but what's weird about them is that even despite that, US action in Ukraine is kind of against the grain of US policy tendentiously, which is to withdraw. So as much as it's true that we're not supporting Ukraine with a clear strategy, our support for Ukraine is still a sort of a remnant from a way of going on the international scene that is part of the past rather than part of the future, right? So we have a dissolved global order that's still there, but in segments and remnants and ruins. And the very idea that you could even seriously talk about Russia joining that in 2035 or 2040 is absurd. There is nothing to join. That's a big problem for us in the West. There is nothing to join. And we can't overcome it unless we overcome our democratic challenges at home. Because it's only if Western democracies are strong that we can elaborate something approaching a stable global system. But we're not going to be able to do that because our democracies will continue to decline, but we can stop the rate of decline by reflecting properly on how to do that, and we'll keep discussing that. So that's the first thing. There is no global order, Vladimir, for Russia to join. Number 2. What about this promise of a future democratic Russia? Where is the politics in that? I appreciate that that's a moral aspiration, but I'm going to say something harsh. It's not just apolitical, but it is arguably actually a remnant, and this is not something that I absolutely consciously attribute to Vladimir, but it is a remnant of a certain kind of Russian imperialist tendency to talk about the civilized world, joining the civilized world. Because when you take away imperial prejudices, the point isn't just to take them away. And we shouldn't exaggerate this about the Russian opposition. They have taken them away to a good extent. They've got more work to do. But when you take these prejudices away, you're still under an imperialist shadow if you haven't replaced them with anything constructive, you see? So you're still caught up in imperialism if you have put down imperial ideas and imperial prejudices but haven't replaced them with anything else except apolitical vacuities, like joining the civilized world and celebrating democratic virtue. Now, don't laugh too hard. This is what Ukraine's coming up with, right? This is a large part of Ukraine's justification to the world about what it is and why it should be supported. So that's to say, depoliticized, vague siren songs about joining the civilized world. Which actually used to be effective in the first year of war. Now they do as much to undermine Ukraine as they do to help it. And we too ourselves talk about civilizational clash between democracy and authoritarian regimes, and us being on the side of democracy, and on we go from that, making nice slogans. But the truth of the matter is that if you're going to make the case for democracy, it's got to be political. It can't be aesthetic. It can't be based on moralization devoid of politics. It can't just be based on algorithmically popular slogans. So, you want to talk about democracy in Russia? Vladimir, let's talk politics. Let's not talk principles. Otherwise, we're going to sound like a cartoonish version of Francis Fukuyama in 1992. So, I would accept that Russia's regime is out of sync with the population. The regime is much more maniacally imperialist and much more obscurantist than the population. I would accept that the regime has lost the younger generation and is trying to almost skip the younger generation and create a future, more fascistized younger generation to keep itself stable, keep the regime stable. I accept all of that. But where's the politics? Right? So politics is about transformation, it's about agency, it's about who is going to do what, how, and when. And it's about power, right? And I'm worried that there aren't any conversations of substance among the Russian opposition about this. What if you woke up overnight and you noticed a more politicized Russian opposition? What would that look like? They would immediately make cogent, practical, reformist, programmatic proposals to not just different demographics in Russia, but to different institutions in Russia. They would address the interests of the security agencies. They would address the interests of the army, right? They would tell these institutions what future they're proposing. And just taking these positions in of itself will begin to have a politicizing effect. The risk of speaking in moral terms is that a future Russia should have no army because it'll be peaceful and democratic, and all the countries around it will be peaceful and democratic. You're not going to achieve any transformation like that. You also have to engage with Russia's non-insane security interests, right? What are Russia's security interests if you take away imperialist mania? Speak to those, right? And use care for those, concern with those, to compel different agencies in the country, different institutions to take you seriously, right? With moral principle and high-spirited siren songs to the virtues of democracy, you could speak to 6% of the Russian population, maybe 10%. So that's the second thing I would say. There's something seraphically apolitical about this invitation to entertain a democratic Russia seriously. And there is a third point to make about the interdependence between European democracy and European security and what happens in Russia that Vladimir Kara-Murza talks about. How do we think about this? Well, one response that's unconstructive is to pick, as quite a few people on Twitter have done, on Kara-Murza talking about Russia being big and say, well, that's evidence of an imperialist mindset. Russia's big and powerful, you're always going to have to deal with it. That response is just a mirror, and a worse mirror, of the depoliticization that Kara-Murza may himself be engaging in. So you don't want to throw yourself into the same pot you're trying to critique. If you want to take that thought seriously, you could run into the question of what is legitimate self-governance for people on the Russian territory, and then you'd have to admit that it's up to them, not up to you, whether you're in Kazakhstan, Canada, or New Zealand. So he called Russia big, and here I go writing a Twitter thread about it, is the very depoliticized politics that is sinking the Russian opposition and is also sinking Western democracies. And they just express it in a more intense way than we do. They're more extreme. The second thing I would definitely not do also is fantasize about the magical vanishing of Russia, which ain't gonna happen. A lot of the content you're exposed to indulges in these fantasies, and algorithms enormously reward them. But the truth is, there's no agency in these accounts. There's no way to get to that fantasy outcome. Either Russia is there, because nobody's gonna march on Moscow, and Russia retains its integrity, or it doesn't. And if Russia loses its territorial integrity, we'll still have to deal with what's there. That may mean dealing with wars, civil wars, epic refugee currents, and potentially rump Russia, armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons and resentful of the West. So however you cut it, we're going to have to deal with Russia in one form or another. And magical thinking that invites us to transcend that is a common form of depoliticization. And so if we do that, we just jump back into the same pot we're trying to critique. Ideally, you'd want to propose something for the ex-Soviet space that comes out of the prevailing nature of the global arrangements, but the prevailing global arrangements are themselves in decline. You see, and so we have a problem. The West has no strategy for a global order and, no capacity to implement a strategy because of democratic weakness at home. As a result, it has no vision for the ex-Soviet space. As a result, it has half a strategy for Ukraine and no strategy for Russia, and no Russia policy, really. We're half at war with Russia, we have no Russia policy. We're not doing anything special to politicize the Russian space. And given that we lack a strategy and that we're just making do, the political priority ought to be help Ukraine first, think about politicizing the Russian space second, but there's no conflict between these two. You can do both. The Russian opposition don't have a strategy. They don't have a vision for the ex-Soviet space. They don't have a vision of a global order. In fact, they are just singing siren songs from 1989. Largely. It's a bit mean, but we have to be brief and, caricatural within certain truthful brackets. And Ukraine has not proposed anything for the ex-Soviet space. Ukraine hasn't even taken proper steps to give a vision of how the struggle of the Ukrainian people and the struggle of the Belarusian people may be in some respects one struggle. So there's an absence of regional security proposals. There's an absence of strategy from all conceivable sides. What we're left with is simply making do, dealing with Russia by force, or not by force when Russia begins to make security assertions that we perceive as workable and reasonable, which it can't do so long as this regime persists. So I do think that Kara-Murza has a point when he discusses the interdependence of our security and stuff happening on the Russian space. But that point can't just be dressed up in siren songs to the virtue of democracy. It needs to go through all of the political knots that are there, some of which we've just put on the table. Lots of love and thanks so much for being with me. Talk soon.